errors you discovered in the biblical manuscripts? His answer? Essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. What? Tens of thousands of people left the Christian faith because they thought that the cardinal doctrines of the Christian faith were affected by textual variants because of having read this book. And yet now he has to admit that's not the case. We've debated each other 3 times, and every time I show his quotation on this point, and he can't refute it because he knows that's what he said. He knows that that's what he believes.
You know, sometimes I think that God just superintends and blinds people like Muslim by Choice and Yahya Snow just to get this stuff into other Muslims' heads. I really do. Because did you just hear that? Who is the favorite apostate amongst Muslims? Bart Ehrman. What did Dan Wallace just say? His fundamental argument is bogus. And what is the fundamental argument? The very argument that must be used by Muslims to come up with the idea that the deity of Christ and all the rest of this stuff was somehow smuggled into the text and it's all been changed and blah, 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 blah. You just put this out and you don't realize what it says? Anyways, his whole point's coming up here in a moment. But anyway.
So consequently, the kind of debate gets over pretty quickly at that point. Is what we have now what they wrote then? In all particulars? I don't know. Probably not. 666, 616, fasting and prayer.
Okay, now what's he talking about there? When he says 666 and 616, do you even know, Yahya? I know, because I've used Dan's joke about this for years. It's one of the best jokes, and I've always given him credit. Everybody who's ever heard me tell the joke knows that I give him credit for this. So everybody tell Dan I have been very particular in crediting him this. And it's also a protective mechanism, because if they end up being really strong premillennials, they can go after him instead of me. But do you know what he just said? Because if you don't know what he just said, then you're not going to understand what his point is. And very often you don't understand what the point is. Yeah, that's the problem. 666, 616, the two major variants in Revelation chapter 13. And in fact, I bring up in my presentation, in the presentation you quoted from, I brought up an image of one of the papyri and zoom in on it and show it says 616 instead of 666. But you see, if you understood New Testament textual criticism, and if you would listen to Dr. Wallace's lecture, we know about those two because we have sufficient manuscripts to recognize where the variation is. And his point is, we have variants in the text. We all admit that. But this is the very same man who, in an interview with Rob Bowman presented to him an illustration that he uses, and Dan thought it was brilliant, because it is. And that is, Rob said, what we have with the New Testament is that we have a 10,000 piece jigsaw puzzle, and we have 10,100 pieces. Not that we have 9,900. The point being, we possess all of the original readings. The original of Revelation 13 is either 666 or 616. It's one of the two. That's what he's talking about. You don't seem to understand that. But that's what I was talking about too in my presentation. But you've got this filter on that you're always trying to find. You know, in this instance, you've created a contradiction that didn't actually exist because of your ignorance of, an ignorance that you didn't have to have. If you had but just listened to everything he said, everything I said, with some semblance of fairness, a desire to learn. And you, unfortunately, do not have that desire to learn. Okay. No, you can go ahead and take that down. In fact, there There it goes. Okay. So we have covered a lot of ground today. And it hasn't been light, fluffy ground, and it hasn't been, most of it has not been really good preaching ground either. I mean, hopefully some of the information and some of the assertions regards to the nature of divine revelation have been important. But once again, I'm sure I'm going to hear from a lot of folks, why you're always attacking other Christians. Let's just be honest. Dr. Licona didn't need to talk about hermeneutical gymnastics. He very plainly has in his mind a division between his perspective, which he identifies as being the scholarly perspective, and the strict inerrantist perspective of a Norman Geisler and people like him. And I know that encounter differently, but you must learn to differentiate between what people are saying, the content of what they're saying, and who they are. I don't care if you don't like me, don't like the way I look, that I ended up having to go to a pretty liberal seminary. I learned to listen to people with whom I have disagreements, filter what they say through a recognition of what their worldview is and what the differences I have with their worldview is, grab the gems and the nuggets of gold and get rid of the rest. I think that's maturity. And man, that's not how our world thinks today, and unfortunately a lot of it comes right into the church. What Dr. Licona said needed to be responded to. And hopefully we've done so meaningfully, accurately, fairly. We played all of his comments. We let him speak for himself. It's not like we just summarized his position or something. And that kind of communication needs to continue on. And I have to be able to say, I consider this very important. I consider this issue to be extremely central to our apologetic methodology and approach, without then taking the next step that most people take, and that means Mike Licona is going to hell in a bobsled. You don't need to do that. Leave Dr. Licona to the Lord.